This is Beyond the Resume, the podcast that brings you the stories, advice, and insights behind some of the most successful people in real estate. Beyond the Resume is brought to you by Jackson Lucas Executive Search, the industry leader in human capital solutions. Here is Lisa Flicker.
Welcome to the Jackson Lucas Beyond the Resume podcast. Today we have Sharif Mitchell. Sharif, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm particularly excited to talk to you a little bit about the artwork behind you, but we'll get into that. Mine is just a boring picture of my husband and I when we got married. So
love that too.
But that's my own form of art, right?
There you go. There you go. Exactly.
So Sharif, would love to just hear a little bit about, we'll dive into your entire story, but maybe some of the highlights of how you got to where you are.
Sure. Well, no, as mentioned, appreciate the opportunity. It's definitely been a journey. 20 years post-college, I'm celebrating my 20-year reunion next year at Morehouse. And, it's just been a journey that to get to the point where you want to be an owner operator. And so I took a non-traditional path to get here. Out of college, went and thought I was going to be a broker. Took a job at Trammell Crow. I ended up in the property tax consulting business, which really was a great opportunity for me. Just coming out in 06, heading right into the Great Recession a few years later. And so valuations were plummeting. It became, I always say, our bull market. And it was a tremendous opportunity to value properties of all asset types across the country, meet different sponsors, owner operators, et cetera. And so I had a really good idea of the challenges that we face during down cycles. But, I had the opportunity to make some money, during that time and saw some of the perks of being in the real estate business. And so ended up on my own and started my first company, MDI Companies, in 2010, and then rolled that into a larger firm doing tax appeals and moved to New York to run that region for Paradigm Tax Group at the time. And so, it was a great opportunity to get to the big city. I'd always wanted to live in New York and chase, more zeros as one of my mentors would say. And so I had the opportunity to work with big funds and big owner operators and allocators, et cetera, like Blackstone, Starwood, Clarion, and learned, what it looked like at the institutional level. And so at the top of the cycle, decided it was time to rebrand and retool a little bit. The industry was going to really consider me just a property tax professional, but thought I was more of a real estate professional. And so I needed to kind of get a little bit more, just brand recognition and just a different, lens behind me. So I went to Chase Bank here in New York, and I was a balance sheet lender on rent stabilized multifamily, your typical walk-ups in New York. And so I really started to understand how to mitigate risk. Obviously the credit box was very interesting in JP Morgan. And so it was a tremendous learning ground for me. I think it really made me a better investor. And so during that time, I realized, yes, I want to own and operate multifamily. New York was heavily regulated, still is. And so, the business plan was to kind of buy workforce housing, rent stabilized like properties, just in non-regulated markets. In 2017, left the bank to start the entrepreneurial journey full time, and really have been, kind of building the business, ever since. We bought our first property in 2015. This marks our 10-year anniversary of the first property. It was a triplex in the Northern Liberties neighborhood of Philadelphia, hence the name of the firm. That's where we got started. It was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so as we think about workforce housing, we think about housing stability, which translates to freedom and economic freedom. And so that's kind of the background behind the name. But from that deal, we did a few deals in the neighborhood and ultimately have grown the business, multiple iterations of the business. This is the third one of such, but combined, we've done about 500 million of real estate transactions, acquired about 3,000 units between Pennsylvania, down to Virginia. We bought a deal in Maryland this year in Silver Spring, where I grew up. And then we bought our first deal in Texas last year. So, we're continuing to try to scale, build the business. We've got a great team. We've got, great, assets under management right now, and looking to continue to buy workforce housing around the country. So that's the journey so far.
Love that. And, I love that you, like I also love to do, mentor young folks transitioning into real estate careers. And I think the bulk of the audience, other than your family and friends who will be listening, will likely be folks who are thinking about getting into real estate. They might be in school or even pivoting over from another career. Do you think there was one kind of defining moment early in your career when you thought, yeah, real estate is what I want to do, or I really want to own my own business? Tax is such a great launching pad, but is there something that kind of brought you to here that you could define?
So it's a funny story. I actually quickly I got a full ride to Morehouse College, and so my mother, was very congratulatory and gave me my first year's tuition and said, this is the last gift I'll give you. Be go forth and prosper. And I bought a townhouse in college as a freshman and moved off campus. And so I had 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. I rented out the 2 bedrooms. And so I lived for free and I was going to school for free. I'm like, hey, the cash flow is great. And so I knew I wanted to be in real estate at that point. I got my real estate license in college. I was selling homes and I got to a point where there's one deal particularly that stands out. The woman was very emotional. It was her home, and she wanted the walls this color versus another color, and and ultimately the deal didn't transpire. And so at that moment, I realized that parts of the business could be too emotional, and I wanted to be more on the analytical side. And so I knew I had to get to commercial real estate, where it was where deals were made on a different set of facts and numbers. And so
And then you realize they're probably still as emotional, but just they hide it better.
correct. Yeah, that's for sure, especially in this economic time. Yeah. But definitely, it was a lot of trial and error, honestly. I always say just get in. The thing for me that I wish I would have done a little bit earlier is gone to a bank a little bit earlier. Just such a capital intensive business. You need to be in the capital markets all the time. And so, I got to the bank later. I could have gone out of college. Who would have known things might have been different, but generally, I always say get into an institution as big as you can. You'll learn a lot. You'll see a lot, and try to figure out the asset class you like, the market, but you're not going to know out of college or what. So get into a place and then just start, understanding kind of, how the business runs, what you like, what interests you, and then, kind of navigate that way. And so for me, honestly, I love hotels. But I just knew without having an operations background out of Cornell, it would be tough to raise money to go buy them. And so I said I'd start with multi, and down the road we pivot into some hotel ownership. And that was just kind of understanding the business, right, and understanding that that was real estate with an operating business, and it's very different than traditional, ownership of office buildings or whatnot. So all of these things you learn as you go, and you just have to get in and start kicking the tires.
Well, my husband runs a hotel company, so
There you go.
if you ever want to get involved, let me know.
Absolutely, it's still is part of the dreams for sure.
I love that. I love that. Well, during COVID, it was not a dream to own any hotels.
Understood. Understood. Yep.
So
Absolutely.
I you know, I usually would ask what some of the bigger risks that you've taken to get to where you are. Now, obviously, taking every penny you have that your mother gave you and investing that in a townhouse feels, but I know when you're 18 years old, you freedom is having nothing to lose, so you put it all on red. What are some of the risks that you feel like you've taken more recently to kind of get to where you are?
Yeah, I think I think for me it's always my driving force has always been knowing what I'm worth, figuring out what people will pay for that, and figuring out if I'm good with it, to be honest. And so the risk for me would be not betting on myself to step out and give this a shot to be a full-time entrepreneur. It's just, I have too much belief in myself. And so I think that it would have been worse if I would have never left to try it out on my own. And again, it's tough. Entrepreneurship is lonely, but you've got to, if you believe in yourself and you believe in what you have to offer the world, go for it. And so I think the biggest risk would have been not taking this risk. Because at the end of the day I can always go back and get a job, right? And and I've always said, if you know what you're worth and you know where your floor is, if you could live off that, if things go to zero, then why not take the shot? And obviously with now with kids and family, it's much different. You've got to mitigate the risk, and you have to have a plan. It has to be actionable, and you need to figure out a path to profitability quickly, especially in this environment, because again, it is much tougher as the stakes get higher. But what I would say is for those that are, on the path maybe to entrepreneurship, is really fix your costs and figure out, what you can and can't live with, build that budget, and then, mark your life to that. And I think for me, being in the brokerage community and seeing, some brokers have big years and down years, I saw, or developers going boom and bust. You really have to kind of have a base case floor that you can always achieve, and then take the risk from there. So that's how I always approached it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and it's interesting because it's easy to look back and say you have to take the risk, but it's harder when you're in that moment.
For sure.
So, Northern Liberties has grown and you have a pretty unique presence in real estate. Can you walk me through the vision behind the company and maybe share a moment or two when you realized you were truly building something special and different?
Yeah, well, I always, it's funny. At the bank, you always say, know your customer, right? And, I was raised by a single mom, and so, as I think about the opportunities afforded to me, it's always been through housing stability, right? I never had to worry about where I would lay my head. And so, that kind of created a purpose driven life for me. And so, we want to focus on acquiring, well located multifamily assets close to job demand generators, right? It's a notion for me to really want to cut down commutes through trauma. I commuted to, high school an hour and a half each way. And so, that was, that impacted me, which is why I love living in New York, where I don't have to drive if I don't want to. And I can, walk and get to work quickly. And so for me, and what we learned, and the data suggests this, that people will take less money now. I think it's 20% less now to have no commute. And so, ultimately, we want to try to find the opportunities to buy apartment buildings in neighborhoods close to jobs, and not be the top of market rent, not be, not sacrifice quality, in where you live, but, do so in a responsible way. And so for us, our purpose is to, create housing stability, create opportunity, create mixed income opportunities so people that live there could see upside, be exposed to opportunity. The lawyers with debt live next to the single moms and the seniors, right? And so it's important for us to kind of create those communities, where everyone can thrive and live. And so that's where our mission is. It's do well by doing good. And for us, it's knowing our customer. We know who we serve, and we get up every day trying to find opportunities to really create affordable and workforce housing. So that's the mission.
Such a good mission. I agree with you. When you mix the neighborhoods, so you have a lawyer living next to, it really, so it allows for the children to grow up because I feel like I grew up like that, right? Like you grow up in a way that you're like, oh, I see, I, I
That's
see
right.
what a banker is, and it's not just a teller. In your communities, do they do any kind of like outreach or social, like are there community events that
Yeah,
are
yeah.
helpful?
So, it's funny. It's going back to the hotel quote. I learned quickly heads in beds is important, right? So, we're always thinking about retention. And if we can have a resident stay with us for, about 3 to 4 years, we've won. And we love it, especially when they go off to go buy a home. So I always look at the exit interviews and, why did you leave to go buy a home? I love that, right? But yeah, so when we buy a property within the first 90 days, we do a resident survey. So we've, for the most part, know who's living there, but we want to know more about them, education levels, what their priorities are. Are they looking for after school program? Do they want health and wellness information? Do they want financial literacy? So we survey the community, and then we curate monthly programming through an affiliate resident services firm. And we offer that to our communities each month. And then of course through the life of our hold, we offer that monthly programming. So it is resident services. We see it as a function of both creating community, but also solid asset management, because we're touching the residents beyond just asking for rent, right? Or filling out work orders. And so we know our residents. Again, it goes back to knowing your customer, serving your customer. Again, I'll give you an example. We own a property in Dallas. So Dallas has a ton of golf courses, right? We have a golf simulator there. So why not offer golf lessons, or, bring in first tee into the community, putting the putting greens around the pool, and allowing the kids to play, and then go in the simulator, and you can play around like that, right? And so, things like that expose, again, it's access and exposure. It's about retention. It's about creating community, knowing your neighbor. All of that, we think, creates better communities, and ultimately that, creates, better outcomes, financial and social.
Yeah. And so, we talk, this kind of leads me to a little bit of like, I'm always curious when somebody builds a career like you did, if there are strict daily habits that you have. Some people tell me I wake up at 3 a.m. and I do these 100 things. Some people tell me I run out the door at the last minute. But students always ask, and I always think it's an interesting question, you know, how do you structure your day?
Yeah, and it changes a lot. I think the first thing is you have to have structure, especially as an entrepreneur, right? So when you don't have to be anywhere at a certain time, and when you own your time, what you do with your time is the most important thing, right? And I'd say it's changed a lot. I live in New York. We do no business here. Our equity partners happen to be from New York, but our business motto is blue city within a red state. So I'm on a lot of planes and many other markets. I do love living in New York, and so I say all that to say, we want to be dads first, right? Our most of our team, my partner and our first hire, we're all girl dads first, and so we want to be fathers first, right? I lost mine at a young age, and so I make sure that when I'm in town, I don't start my day until after I drop them off at school. And so once they're at school, I go get a cup of coffee. I typically read the news for about an hour. So I read, a couple different publications, both real estate and or just global, just to know what's going on in the world and make sure I'm on top of all the topics because I spend a lot of time speaking to people, right, raising capital for deals, and so I want to make sure that I'm well abreast on everything. From that point, I'll typically head to the office if I don't have meetings in the city or lunches trying to meet, for coffee or whatnot to raise capital and to stay, in the know of what's going on in the deal flow and in the markets. And then, from I'd say, if there are no meetings during that day, they're either going to be calls or just desk time from about 11 to 7 every day. I'm trying to push everything forward, right? And again, the CEO lens is both working on the company, working on deals, thinking about talent, thinking about strategy, et cetera. So I'll break up my day doing those things, right? And then depending on the evening, whether I go do bedtime or I have to go to a meeting, that's how the night usually ends, and then we get up and do it again. But the key, I think, to success, and one of my mentors said, is just get up every day and go to work, right? And good things will happen if you're just consistent. And so, you know, the routine is important.
The the routine is so important, and I always talk to these young folks who think like, "I wanna work remotely for my entire career," and it's just like I think to myself, "You know what? If you're next to somebody, what you're hearing, what you're learning, it's so valuable."
For sure.
And it doesn't mean you have to be there every day from 8 to 8, but being around people,
In the real estate business is there's still people on the other end of the transactions, right? It's a people business. A lot of people go into getting deals closed, and so you need to know who you're working with. You need to know who you trust. Especially in these environments. I always say my lender is my best friend from college. And we've known each other since we were 18 years old, and so there's nobody I would want to be in a boat with in choppy waters than him, right? Trying to get a deal closed, and so you've got to network. I got some good advice when I was younger. When I first started working at Trammell Crow, one of the brokers said you have to spend as much time out in the street as you do in the office because that's how deals happen and that's how you get it done. And so I always took that to heart, and I try to make sure that I'm attending events. I'm going to conferences. I'm going to presentations. Market data presentations. I even like to teach classes, or attend, different workshops or whatnot, just to be in the market. And then I like to be around other sponsors, right? I like to feel, empowered, and I like to feel, motivated, right? And by other enthusiasm for other people going through the same thing we're going through, right? And so, again, entrepreneurship's lonely. And so you want to be around people because it is very lonely, and to be able to pick up the phone. I mean, another guest of yours, Ty Barnes. I call Ty once a week. Hey, Ty, what's going on? What are you doing? What are you seeing? And so, it's important. And it is a people business. And so you've got to really get past the remote work. I just don't think it works. And yes, we want to be flexible, and, the new way of working is important, but, let's not, the basics still, matter in this
basics
business.
matter. Yeah. Absolutely. So were there any, it's always easy to look at you and say like, "Oh, it was all great. His mom gave him this money and then he turns it into this
Um,
and then he turns it into that." I imagine there were some failures or setbacks that might have thrown you off course a little bit. Anything you want to share?
Yeah, the first thing I always say is you have to really know yourself, especially on the entrepreneurship journey. I've got finance friends now the same age that are, making 7, 8 figures, and that's just not the path for real estate owners, right? You have to wait to harvest. And so I think the first thing is humbling yourself, knowing that your time will come, and the upside will be there if you work hard. And so I always think that's the first thing, that you just have to make sure you're mentally tough. The business, the game, it's a wave. It's up and down. And so the key is to kind of stay even kill. And so that's what I would say that is the first thing from a personality trait, right? It's managing emotions and managing expectations of yourself, and not marking yourself to other people. I think is very important. I'd also say, some partnership things, right? It's when you have a business like a marriage, it's a partnership like that, right? And so, you know, you got to figure out not, when things are good, but how do you make decisions when things are tough or things are going wrong? And, knowing who your partners are is very important. And so I would say that's something that, I didn't always get right, but you learn from and kind of move on. And so I would say, really do, figure that out. And then I think the last thing is just making sure you have the ability to persevere, because it is a cyclical business. And again, I started my career in the Great Recession. I don't know what this is, but it's tough.
Definitely tough.
And so you've got to push through, right? And you've got to figure out a way to survive. And I always say, if you're in the game, you will be able to score. You just have to stay in the game. And so I think those are important things to think about. It's not always great, right? I mean, we've bought 2 deals, in 2 years. We were thinking we'd be at 7 to 10 by now, right? And so we timed the market right from a basis perspective, but the capital's not flowing. So that's just a challenge that we have to work through. And so just being able to persevere.
That reminds me of there's a famous Wayne Gretzky quote, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? You got to
That's
be in it. You got to get up and do it. So you had referred to a few people that might have helped you along the way. None of us do this alone. Are there any mentors or people that you really think kind of led to your success and where you are right now?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, plenty. Everywhere from family, friends to, people you just meet in passing. But, I would say, the Real Estate Executive Council, REIS, for me has been one of the greatest gifts that I could have had. Right. So it's a large, trade association for minorities and people of color in real estate. Right. And so, I've been a member now for at least 15 years and have met tremendous, people there, business partners, mentors, colleagues, deal partners. I mean, so much has come out of that organization for me. Too many names to actually name, but the members know who they are. And so I've gotten a lot of support, mentorship, help. I was on the phone with 3 or 4 different last night, as I was, trying to work through something. And so, I would say just go through the membership, and many people will help me along the way.
And I'll find all your people. Well,
There
I
you go.
know I've known Ken McIntyre for probably like 30 years now,
There you
and I
go.
know he's one of the good
He's
guys.
he's definitely, I call him the Godfather, and he's definitely one of those on the list for sure.
It's interesting because I belong to a few women's organizations, and the other day someone stood up and said, "If we don't have each other's backs, who has our backs?" And it was such an interesting moment in time because everyone's so focused on me, me, me. But I think when you get into these organizations, if you're really willing to like, give of yourself, I find that what you get back is just so valuable.
Yeah, and I always say, at the end of the day, we're still all human, right? And we all have we have the same challenges of life, right? We can all be parents, marriages, ailing parents, etc. I mean, we all have things that we share in common, right? And so I think definitely opening up and being transparent about who you are, right? I think the first thing is knowing who you are, but then of course opening up and sharing that with the world. I think it's important. It's necessary, right? So yeah, definitely, I agree.
And I would love to hear a little bit about that beautiful piece of art behind you.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I buy a piece of art, after every deal closing, just to kind of commemorate the journey. I always remember the place and time, of the deal, and every deal, of course, is a story in itself. So this is a piece called "When Flowers Bloom," by an artist out of Miami named Alejandra. And I'm blanking on her last name, but anyone that wants to find out, I can connect you with her. But I was looking for some inspiration, and so I was out with a Reese member, and we were just catching up on life, and I met this artist that night, and said, we were talking about what she does, and she said, this is my portfolio, so I do, it's on my phone. I saw it, it spoke to me. In many ways, it kind of felt like it was myself. I always think about trying to outperform. I've always said I'm a chubby guy from Silver Spring, Maryland, so just
You
trying
don't
to
look like a
outperform every
chubby
day.
guy. So whatever at camera.
Long journey for sure. But generally, and that's kind of been my inner, guide, is just like, just want to outperform everyone else, right? And so when I saw it, it spoke to me. It kind of felt like I was looking at myself, and so that represented the deal we bought last year with Vistria in Dallas, and that was the treat for myself.
Excellent. What was the deal in Dallas?
So we bought a market rate apartment building, 2016 vintage. and converted it with the Dallas HFC. So we made it kind of permanently restricted and permanently workforce. And so we converted it from market rate with the tax abatement structure to restrict rents up to 80% AMI for 99 years. And so it was a great transaction. Bought it with Vistria in Waterford, and it was a great deal, great team, and it's doing very well right now. We're very proud of it. And again, it's a phenomenal transaction, but it's a well located asset close to the medical center, and where we can restrict rents, for the working professionals.
Well, here's where I really will miss my co host, Chris Papa, because he does a really great job of introducing the hot seat. I'm not going to do it justice, but
Okay.
welcome to the hot seat.
Okay, here we go.
It's not that hard. Don't worry. Quick questions. First one is, do you have any book or podcast recommendations? Anything you're currently reading or listening to?
I love the Willie Walker podcast. The Walker Dunlop podcast. I find it to be you know, uh, super informational. And so I do listen to that weekly. I read nonfiction. And so I've been reading a lot lately, real estate icons. Be My Guest, which was Conrad Hilton's book. I read the Sam Zell book, the Alfred Todman book. So I've been reading a lot about, the older icons in our business and focusing on, how they made it through cycles and trying to learn a little bit about the history of where we've been to kind of understand where we're going. And so that's what I've been really doing lately.
What's interesting to me is the kind of the hospitality lens that you likely bring to your developments,
Huh.
which to me is kind of where, it used to be like if you build it, they will come. And I really feel like now people are more like, what can we do for our tenants and community? And I feel like you embody that. So I love
Yeah,
that.
and especially, there's no secret. There's a glut of supply, especially in the Southeast. The product is all commoditized. How do you differentiate, right? Sure, you can do it on rent only so much, but you have to make your performance work, right? And so it's the intangible things you can do to serve your community that make them want to stay, especially when people can move across the street as easily as 30 days notice. And so, you really have to serve your customer, and to do that, you have to know who you're serving, and just continue to focus on that. I think it translates to good real estate and good community.
Yeah. Do you have like when you look back, do you have a favorite deal, whether it was your first deal or something special where you're like, that one I really feels good to me?
Yeah, it's ironically, it's the first deal, and I think more so because we bought a vacant warehouse actually and converted it to mixed use. And it's funny. I took some what I learned at CBRE and Trammell Crow, and we stood on the corner. It's Third and Girard and Philadelphia. Actually, it's our last building in Philadelphia. We're trying to sell it now, actually, and we'll be out of that market. I sat on the corner and I counted cars. And it was just a basic real estate, thing, but I actually put it in practice. You hear about it, but you put it in practice and you read it in the reports. But ultimately, we knew, because the building had 48 feet of street frontage relative to the other 17 or 18 feet, buildings, we knew we had something that we shouldn't chop up the building, but we would leave it as one, ground floor retail. And we were able to get an institutional retail tenant through UPS store. And so we had an owner operator, the first woman owned Black owned UPS store in Philadelphia, along with one of being the highest performing one in the city of Philadelphia right now. And so, that deal for so many different reasons, right? The economics, the impact, the community pillar and the anchor in the community. We got a grant from the city to revitalize the street front. It was just a wonderful deal. And we put everything to work on that deal, right? And learned a lot. And it was just so fulfilling to, have an instinct, to do the work, and it was validating to actually accomplish it and execute on the business plan. So that was a fun one, and obviously, very fond where we started.
And how about when you hire people? Is there something in particular that you look for, a personality trait, a statement, or whatever it might be that makes you think this person's going to do well with me?
Yeah, I like people that tell me what they know and what they don't know. I like, people that, let me know that they're inquisitive and want to learn. I do like to see a little hustle and grit, right? And so I tend to, hire people that have put in an offer or two on a building before to buy, right? Because it's really, it's going out and trying to do something on their own. To me, that entrepreneurial spirit you can't teach. And so I like to, and it's funny, everybody on our team owns a piece of real estate. So it's really cool in that sense. But those are the things that then I really try to focus on the intangibles. Again, you can learn the modeling and the math, but it's the intangible qualities that I want to see, because the goal is for me to help you create a platform for you to go off and do your own thing or go off to great, grander pastures, right? That to me is success, right? I don't want people to stay with me forever. I want them to, grow and grow out. And so I just see myself as just being a road for others to build off of. So those are the things I really focus on.
And the last piece that I wanted to end with is if you have any advice for the listeners, anything that someone wants to follow in your footsteps, is there any single piece of advice that kind of stands out as something?
Yeah, I always say I view the world 2 years forward, 10 years backward, right? And so, you have to do everything step by step, a day at a time, right? And so, what do I need to do in 2 years to get closer to my 10-year goal? And in theory, if you keep pushing, you'll never catch it, right? And so, you're always pushing, but you always are realistic in kind of what you have to do to get there. You have to build blocks, literally, one foot in front of the other. So that's what I always say is like, have a plan, have a 10-year plan. And then what do the next 2 years look like to achieve that, that plan and that goal. And that's how I try to live my life.
I think that's wonderful. Well, Sharif, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was really, really wonderful getting to know you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Resume, a Jackson Lucas podcast where we take a deep dive into the career journeys of some of the top minds in real estate and equip you with the knowledge to move forward in your path towards the success you've envisioned. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Beyond the Resume. We're grateful for your support. All episodes of Beyond the Resume are brought to you by Jackson Lucas, building inclusive and diverse businesses through talent acquisition. Visit us at jacksonlucas.com.